Good afternoon. I want to start this conversation really by trying to truly understand exactly what the purpose of this meeting is. This is not the first such meeting I've participated in, and the last one was kind of confusing because I think that we went into it expecting to have our normal ability as lawmakers to discuss, engage, and amend the text before us. And as the good chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, it does not appear we have the ability to amend this document. And I'm just curious about that. Is there a statute that governs what our authority is in this meeting with regard to this language? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
To the ranking member, Senator Sampson, the answer is yes. That statute is Connecticut General Statutes, Section 23-A, and in particular, subsection A of that statute. To you.
I appreciate that information. Can you tell me what it says?
Sure. So the title is Explanatory Text Concerning Proposed Constitutional Amendments, preparation, approval, printing, distribution, posting at polls. Subsection A of that section says, at such time as a proposed constitutional amendment and its concomitant ballot question are approved by the General Assembly for presentation to the electors of the state for their consideration at a general election, the Office of Legislative Research shall prepare a concise explanatory text as to the content and purpose of the proposed constitutional amendment subject to the approval of the Joint Standing Committee of the General Assembly having cognizance of constitutional amendments. Upon such approval, the Secretary of the State shall cause such proposed amendment and such explanatory text to be printed and transmitted to the town clerk and to the registrars of voters in each town in the state in sufficient supply for public distribution. And there's a subsection B to that section, but it deals with the Secretary of the State's printing of the explanations and how and in what measure, et cetera, they must be printed. To you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that information. It just leads me to kind of another question, which is, would it be in our purview to offer an amendment to potentially change that statute simultaneous with a potential change to the explanatory text? Or would that somehow not be with our rules?
I can give you my opinion, and we can also check in with LCO if you'd like. I think the authority given to us by the statute is pretty clear on its face. We're given the authority only to confirm or reject the language that's been transmitted to us by OLR. If we were going to change the underlying statute, and just as a matter of state constitutional law, we would have to go through the normal legislative process. We'd have to be in session. We'd have to raise a bill. It would have to exit the committee. It would have to be voted on by the full General Assembly and then approved by the governor or approved over his veto. To you.
Yeah, the good chairman, I'm sure you know that we do many changes in statute without the committee process being involved. And I'm not suggesting that's a good idea or even something I want to get into today. But is it the fact that the question is the direct result of a resolution that has been adopted by both chambers that is restricting our ability to make that amendment? And if so, how does that interact with the explanatory text, which was not part of that resolution?
So I think the answer to your question is yes to you. The explanatory text, its drafting is triggered by the passage of the resolution through the required constitutional process. And this statutory section gives us the authority and the responsibility to review it as we're doing today and either confirm or reject that explanatory text. So we're limited by the state constitutional process for amending the state constitution, and then also the Connecticut statutes that designate how we can amend the procedures for a constitutional amendment being considered by the public on the ballot.
I appreciate that interpretation, Mr. Chairman. I've never actually agreed with it. I kind of old school in that I think that if there's no law that specifically denies us the ability to perform a certain act, then it's a lawful act. And you've used the term reject or deny or something like that a couple of times. But I think what you read was that the committee's obligation is to approve the question. And that's a vague enough term for me to, read into it that we have the ability to approve a question. That would mean we also have the ability to modify it. And I guess that's where our dispute lies. I won't belabor it too much because, I know how these things go. We've been down this road before. I've attempted to offer amendments on the second go around of the resolution, and that was decided by the president or the lieutenant governor in the Senate, suggesting that somehow that is not appropriate because of the resolution, and made much the same argument that you did. So again, I won't go down that road. I just think it's unfortunate because I think we're in a situation where we want to get this right, and leaving the nonpartisan staff to the job of drafting something that is going to be used in the process of making a constitutional change in our state without the participation of lawmakers, other than an up or down vote, I think is difficult for me to accept. Is it your position, Mr. Chairman, that really the only option we have here is if I were to make a compelling enough argument to you that this needs to be changed, that we could vote down this explanatory text, and that might trigger OLR to have to go back to the drawing board? Is that the way you understand it?
To you, Senator Sampson, to the good senator, yes, that's my understanding. If we were to vote down the explanatory text, the draft explanatory text has been presented to us today, it would then go back to the Office of Legislative Research to redraft that text in accordance with any indications that we gave for how it should be redrafted. I'm assuming through debate, but there would be no official mechanism for us to direct them to do anything in particular with that text. We would be indicating informally through our debate how we believe the text should be changed in a manner that we would approve it. And then it would go back to OLR for them to redraft and resubmit to us, and then back to us for approval under the statute to you.
Thank you. And that's kind of what I expected to hear. So what would the timeline be on something like that? Do you think that it's already the 15th of August, right? And I know that there's a point at which ballots need to be printed and so forth. So is it possible that I'm not suggesting that we're going to get there today. I'm just curious to know that given that set of circumstances, there was a compelling argument made, and we found enough votes in this committee to reject the explanatory text before us. What does the timeline look like for OLR to reproduce that, and then for you to properly notice another meeting, et cetera?
To the good ranking member, my understanding, and we can get confirmation from LCO on this if possible, I believe that the deadline for approval of the explanatory text is August 30th for all the deadlines to be properly followed. So if the text were rejected today, it would need to be redrafted, and we need to have another meeting before then.
Right. Yeah, that's unfortunate. That doesn't leave much of a timeline for a resolution, especially if it may take a couple of tries for us to get this right. And I'll just stress, for anyone watching that, we're talking about a very significant change to our Constitution. And certainly it's rightfully being left up to the voters of Connecticut to make the final decision. But the question and the explanatory text that is placed before the voters is critically important. And I think we all understand that the way these items are written can have a significant impact on whether or not this resolution passes or not. And I'll get into that in just a second. I guess I have one more question about the explanatory text, and that is for the edification of anyone listening. Where does this text go? Where will it be seen by voters? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
To you, to the good ranking member, it will be, I believe, displayed publicly. Actually, it says in subsection B of the same statutory section we've been discussing, says that the Secretary of the State shall print the explanations of proposed constitutional amendments as required by subsection A of this section on posters of a size to be determined by said Secretary, and shall mail at least 3 such posters for every polling place within a town to the registrars of voters. Said registrar shall cause at least 3 such posters to be posted at each polling place at which electors shall be voting on such proposed constitutional amendments. Any posters received by the registrars in excess of the number required by the subsection to be so posted may be displayed by said registrars at their discretion, at locations which are frequented by the public. No expenditure of state funds shall be made to influence electors to vote for or against any such constitutional amendments. So that's how they will be displayed to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Between you and me, and of course anyone else that can hear the sound of my voice, I'm not really satisfied with that as the best possible way to convey to potential voters the impact of this question. I just feel like most people are going to be in line voting and inclined to cast their vote for their candidate for president, for example, which is going to be coming up this next election cycle, that this ballot question will appear. And there'll be so few people really aware ahead of time or interested in finding out the details that sadly, I think no matter what we put for the explanatory text, it's not likely to impact a great many decisions. And that's tremendously unfortunate. But what it does is it means that the question is all that more important, that we have a responsibility to get the question right so that voters truly understand the ramifications of their yay or nay vote on that question. And I guess I'll dive right into it, which is, I know that we're here to discuss the explanatory text, but I just want to point out that my concern really is that the explanatory text is the only thing that even gives the slightest indication of what's happening. The ballot question that is going to be offered, that was part of the resolution, it reads, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot? And when I read that, it implies the current law, because the current law already permits the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot. And, you know, we can discuss what the Constitution currently reads and what the current statute reads, but I think it's very clear that the General Assembly is making determinations based on the confines of the Constitution that voters can vote by absentee ballot. Now, they might be included or excluded for eligibility based on certain criteria, but for my purposes, I think the question should be a lot more clear. And I will just make a quick point, which is to say that back in 2014, a similar resolution was passed by the legislature for advancing no excuse absentee voting. And make no mistake, that's what we're talking about. The good chairman opened his remarks by saying we were here to discuss the question and explanatory text on no excuse absentee voting. And yet, in 2014, it was very explicit that the question was about no excuse absentee voting. And I don't want to steal my colleague, Representative Master Francesco's thunder, because I think she wants to make this point even more clear than I'm about to, which is that this question doesn't even mention no excuse absentee voting. Back in 2014, the question read a little differently. And I'll just read that for comparison's sake. It said, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to remove restrictions concerning absentee ballots and to permit a person to vote without appearing at a polling place on the day of an election? And for me, that is a much more explicit explanation about what is happening here. The question that is before us, for me, doesn't really say that anything's going to change from the current law. It does not mention no excuse absentee voting. And the explanatory text, while is a little more thorough, doesn't really get into it much further as it did in 2014. And the whole point of my comments is that in 2014, this question was put before both voters in Connecticut and it failed. So my question, Mr. Chairman, I guess the first thing I would ask is, why aren't we asking the same very explicit and accurate question that we did in 2014? Is it simply because it failed that time?
To you, the good ranking member, I guess I would be cautious to ascribe legislative motives in general, especially considering we're just considering the explanatory text today. But I guess for my part, at least, I will hazard to say that the question that you described and the question that was done in the past is quite confusing in, I think, the majority's opinion to a voter. And this question is shorter, clearer, simpler, and the explanatory text makes clear both the current state of the Constitution and what the question being answered in the affirmative would accomplish. To you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your desire not to ascribe motive, but I'll be happy to do that. And I'm here to state for the record that it's obvious to me that this new question has been drafted and adopted as part of the constitutional amendment resolutions for the express purpose of making it less clear and less simple. Although I will give the good chairman credit, it is shorter. You and I do agree on that. It is shorter than the previous question, but it is not clearer or simpler or more edifying as far as how the Constitution will be changed, in my opinion. And I'll read the two questions again, just for the sake of people watching. The original question that failed was, forgive me that I have the wrong thing in front of me. There it is. Okay. Shall the Constitution of the state be amended to remove restrictions concerning absentee ballots and to permit a person to vote without appearing at a polling place on the day of election? I don't know that you could do better job of explaining that you're allowing for a process of absentee voting that applies to everyone, which is effectively no excuse absentee voting. The new question doesn't mention that people will not appear personally. It doesn't mention that it will apply to every person. It just basically says, are we going to transfer power to the General Assembly to give them a power which is already implicit in the current law, that the General Assembly does allow voters to vote by absentee ballot? And there's not much more to say, but I believe I'm making a compelling argument that this question is drafted for the express purpose of overcoming the fact that it failed when it was put on the ballot the last time. And I believe that is because many people, when they saw that on the ballot in 2014, immediately had reservations with the notion of people voting not in person. And I think the events of the last several years have only added to that. And this question today, I think, would be even less likely to pass than it would be than it was in 2014. But it's a more honest question, Mr. Chairman, and there's no denying that. I feel, somewhat hamstrung here that we're not in a position to do anything except for potentially reject the explanatory text, which, in my opinion, is not going to change the outcome of anything. Even if I could magically compel my colleagues in the majority to see it my way, that doesn't change the question. The question is a matter of the resolution being passed by both chambers already. I would just stress for people watching to understand what has transpired, which is that the majority did pass this resolution through the legislature twice, and they did pass it including this question, and they did pass it knowing that that was the last chance that we had to alter the question. And now it's going to appear on the ballot. And unless there is some concerted effort by the Secretary of State's office, which I don't expect will get involved, or third parties in Connecticut who believe strongly that the impact of no excuse absentee voting is so important that people need to be informed about the importance of this question and what it will imply. Unless that happens, I'm afraid that it's more likely to pass without people truly knowing what can happen as a result. And let me just ask a question or two about what can happen as a result. My understanding, Mr. Chairman, is that if this does go to the ballot as it appears to, and it is passed affirmatively by the voters of the state of Connecticut, what happens next?
To the good ranking member, if the question is approved by the voters by majority this November, then the text that in the current version of the state constitution that designates that only certain reasons may allow for an individual to obtain an absentee ballot will be stricken, and we as the General Assembly will be allowed to legislate who may obtain an absentee ballot and under what conditions, with full latitude, except for the fact that the person will not be able to come vote in person, as well as voting absentee. To you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Constitution will be changed as a result, but before anything really happens that affects the system of voting that we have, the General Assembly will have to meet, debate, and pass legislation modifying the statutory limitations that are on absentee voting. And that's, I'm just summarizing what you just said. Am I correct?
To you, yes.
Okay. That's very good. So does that mean that we would still be able to, if we decided as a General Assembly to include a restriction that says that you can only vote by absentee in the case of sickness, for example?
To you, yes. We would be able to legislate statutorily whatever procedures, restrictions, et cetera, that we as the General Assembly decided were appropriate.
Understood. Understood. Does it mean that we could also expand the ways that people can absentee vote? For example, would that mean that beyond mail-in voting, could that include other forms of voting, online, for example?
To you, I don't believe that there is any constitutional restriction currently on that exact procedure. So I don't believe that would change. But the answer would be yes, the General Assembly could consider other technological forms of voting. To you.
Can I just ask, since you're a member of the majority, can you let me in on what the plans are? You're the House chairman of this committee concerning elections. You have a lot to say about the policy making that's going to happen in the future. What do you envision we do as a statute when we return and this potentially becomes the new constitutional law of the land?
To you, to the good ranking member, while I certainly appreciate your curiosity, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to speculate about what the General Assembly would do in a future session. To you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can understand your reservations for doing that. And I asked the question simply because, we were in the same position not too long ago where we had another very vague question about early voting. And the number one point that I made repeatedly was that we're not even telling the voters how long the early voting period is. And I asked and asked and asked and asked and offered amendment after amendment to try and lock us into some relatively reasonable and short period. And yet I got crickets, sadly. And ultimately, there was no indication of how many days of early voting there would be until long after the constitutional amendment passed. And then we reconvened as a legislature and we heard varying opinions. We had the Secretary of State offered a time frame, one time frame of 5 days, I believe, when she was a candidate for Secretary of State, and then 7 days when she was elected. And then we heard 10 days potentially the governor was advocating for. And we ultimately ended up with 14 days within 17 days for early voting in the general, and then shorter periods for the early voting. And in my opinion is that's been a mistake. I mean, you can look at the numbers over the last several days. I mean, there was such unbelievably little participation in in early voting. I think it's a little premature. Maybe we'll see what happens in the general, but it's concerning that there was so little participation, and yet there was so much effort that had to be put forth by local election officials to staff town hall and make sure that there's people on board, and expenses that taxpayers will ultimately pay for to have a very, very small number of people participate in the early voting process. So I'm hoping that's more successful in the future. But that leads me to another question. Mr. Chairman, do you envision that anything's going to happen with early voting as a result of the potential of expanded no excuse absentee voting? Will these systems coexist side by side as they do now?
To the good ranking member, I don't believe it would be appropriate for me to speculate as to any future legislation that may happen on these points, but I would say just purely as a legal matter, passing this constitutional amendment would allow the General Assembly to make a number of changes to our voting procedures and systems, and theoretically would allow the General Assembly to harmonize the two systems so that they're more efficient while providing maximum appropriate access for all voters in the state.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And again, I mean, I'm not so much trying to ask you to speculate on the actions of 187 members of the legislature. I'm asking you, as the House chairman of the Elections Committee, what do you think? I mean, I have to assume that you're going to have a lot of say in what happens going forward, and I'm just, looking for some direction and some commitment. I mean, I want to work in a bipartisan fashion as much as possible. But in order for me to do that, Mr. Chairman, I've got to know what you're up to. I would like to know exactly what the plan is for the future. If I think that we're going to turn no excuse absentee voting into a mess by adopting online voting, and there'll be even less credentials required, and the integrity of the vote might be at stake, I'm certainly going to be, inclined to go out and oppose it vigorously and make a strong case against it. But if I am hearing that, we're going to try and make our voting system simpler, more concise, we're going to combine the concepts of early voting and no excuse absentee voting, so it's simpler for voters. That's one thing I'm hearing a lot, by the way, is that people are confused. People are unbelievably confused about the different ways to vote and what's required of them to do so. And that's a problem created by this General Assembly passing numerous changes to long-standing policy. And that's a frustration I have. I mean, here we are making multiple changes to our state constitution within a relatively few years. Things that have stood for decades are being changed willy-nilly. And we have significant election integrity issues in our state that people are aware of. And I don't believe those are being addressed or even given the proper attention that they deserve, while we are making changes that I'm afraid will open the door to potentially even more integrity issues. The issue with no excuse absentee voting is that it allows people who are not present at the polls to cast a vote. And has been pointed out by people in both parties numerous times, including the Senate president, you never really know who's casting an absentee ballot. So it is always preferable to have in-person voting whenever possible. And I feel like we're moving in the wrong direction by discouraging in-person voting in favor of mail-in voting. And you can make all the arguments in the world about how this is about access. And I'm all for access, too. And I'm certainly in favor of maintaining absentee voting for people that need it. But I am more inclined to suggest that we should focus on those individuals by catering to them specifically, but requiring able-bodied people that are not otherwise encumbered to encourage them to vote in person in the way that allows for the most reliable result. Okay, so I think I've said most of my piece. I could go on for quite some time talking about the problems with elections in the state, but I know this is not the place or time for it. I will just leave with ending with a comment that I made in the middle, which is that I am not satisfied that the question that is going to be placed on the ballot is a good enough question, for lack of a better term, for the voters. I don't think it is clearer or simpler, and I'm in disagreement with the chairman on that. The question that was asked in 2014 was very clear, and it failed as a result. And I believe that the majority purposely changed the question in an effort to try and pass the same thing, effectively pulling the wool over the eyes of voters about what's actually happening by changing this question in an attempt to get it to pass. And I hope that the news media reports my comments accurately because I think that's the truth. Those are my comments for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.